Washington, D.C., April 2025. The White House Correspondents Dinner, traditionally a lighthearted gathering of journalists and the president, now reflects the polarized political landscape. With Donald Trump back in office, he and his administration have distanced themselves from the event, opting instead to control media access and support pro-MAGA influencers over traditional outlets. Among the attendees was Nancy Pelosi, the seasoned Democratic leader known for her sharp wit and political acumen. Despite her retirement from active politics, Pelosi remained a formidable presence in the political arena, often voicing her critiques of the current administration. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The absence of President Trump and his administration was palpable, but the attendees were eager to hear from the speakers. When Pelosi took the stage, the room hushed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "we find ourselves in unprecedented times. The current administration has chosen to distance itself from this event, perhaps fearing the scrutiny of a free press." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "But what's more concerning," she continued, "is the appointment of individuals who seem more interested in promoting propaganda than in upholding the truth. Take, for instance, the current White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, a 27-year-old with limited experience, now tasked with conveying the president's messages to the nation." The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Pelosi's critique didn't stop there. Ms. Leavitt has made headlines recently, suggesting that the Trump administration may consider suspending the writ of habeas corpus for undocumented immigrants. Such a move undermines the very foundations of our democracy. The room was silent, the weight of Pelosi's words hanging heavily in the air. What the media didn't expect that night was Karoline Leavitt herself walking through the grand entrance of the Hilton Ballroom just minutes after Nancy Pelosi stepped down from the podium. Clad in a deep navy suit with the subtle glint of an American flag pin on her lapel, Karoline's presence drew audible gasps. She wasn't on the guest list. In fact, the Trump administration had officially boycotted the Correspondents' Dinner, calling it a relic of elitist narcissism. Yet here she was. Reporters turned their cameras, flashes blinding the room. Instinctively, the attention pivoted from Pelosi's blistering rebuke to the bold figure making her way toward the front with unmistakable purpose. Karoline paused briefly at the media risers, locking eyes with the CNN table before offering a slight, confident smirk. "I suppose truth crashed the party," she said, loud enough to be picked up on several boom mics. The room buzzed. At the main stage, the MC, a left-leaning satirist invited to host, stammered, "Well, this just took a turn. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems Ms. Leavitt has joined us after all." Karoline didn't wait for an invitation. She walked directly up, whispered something into the host's ear, and a moment later, the mic was turned over to her. What followed was one of the most viral 6 minutes in political history. "Thank you," Karoline began, her voice composed and razor-sharp. "I came tonight not to crash this event, but to confront the lazy, predictable ridicule from an establishment that confuses power with entitlement." She turned to Pelosi directly, who sat stiffly near the front. "Madam Speaker Emerita," she said, "you stood on this stage minutes ago and attempted to humiliate me not with facts, but with tired jabs about age and experience. You called me unqualified. But may I remind you, at 27, Alexander Hamilton was writing the Federalist Papers. At 26, Ronald Reagan was already reshaping American culture." A murmur passed through the crowd. Even a few claps. Karoline didn't stop. "You accused this administration of suppressing the press. But it was your party that colluded with big tech to deplatform dissent. Your party that labeled parents as domestic threats when they stood up at school board meetings. Your party that cheered as Americans were fired for refusing a rushed vaccine, while the president you now deride brought back energy independence, secured our borders, and ushered in a new economic boom." A segment of the crowd burst into applause, mostly young conservative media voices like Benny Johnson and Will Witt, both present in the back rows. Karoline took a breath, then delivered the line that would dominate headlines the next day. "Nancy, you governed with a gavel. I speak with conviction. You called me a propagandist. But I'd rather be a voice for truth than a puppet for decline." There was stunned silence. Even a few liberals looked genuinely impressed. But it wasn't over. "Let me be clear," she said, softening slightly. This country doesn't belong to the political class in this room, left or right. It belongs to Americans who love their families, work hard, and want their leaders to listen more and talk less. That's who I represent. That's who we fight for. And with that, she handed the mic back, turned on her heel, and walked out of the ballroom as swiftly as she'd entered. Phones across the room exploded with notifications. Live streams replayed her words instantly. The hashtags #Leavitt versus Pelosi and #Speechless America began trending within the hour. Back at the MSNBC table, Rachel Maddow muttered, "Well, that wasn't in the script." And at the real-time set in Los Angeles, watching live, Bill Maher tilted back in his chair, smirked, and said on camera, "Now that's how you shake the establishment." The following morning, Washington awoke to a media firestorm. Karoline Leavitt's impromptu appearance at the Correspondents' Dinner had upended the narrative. Networks scrambled to reframe their coverage. CNN's early headline read, "Trump press secretary crashes dinner in defiance of tradition." But by noon, even their anchors had to admit something had shifted. On social media, conservative influencers were on fire. Clips of Karoline's speech flooded Instagram, TikTok, and X, formerly Twitter, often captioned, "She walked in. She spoke truth. She left them stunned." The mainstream outlets tried to focus on the supposed lack of decorum, but it didn't stick. The American public wasn't buying it. And then came Bill Maher. That night, on his HBO show Real Time, Maher opened with his usual monologue, blending irreverence and insight. Known for being a liberal icon who had grown increasingly critical of wokeism and the Democratic Party's excesses, Maher didn't hold back. "Now I know some of you tuned in expecting me to join the chorus and trash Karoline Leavitt," he began, pacing his set with a glass of bourbon in hand. "But I watched her speech and folks, I gotta say, that was impressive." The audience gave a half-hearted chuckle. Maher continued, "Look, I've called Trump a lunatic, I've roasted his cultish followers, and I've said more than once that Fox News is the junk food of journalism. But let me be brutally honest, what Karoline Leavitt did last night wasn't propaganda, it was a wake-up call." The camera panned to the stunned faces of his liberal audience. Maher leaned forward, voice rising. "Pelosi thought she was going to own the night. She thought she could mock a young woman into irrelevance. But what did Karoline do? She walked in without fanfare, without a teleprompter, and gave a speech more coherent than Joe Biden on a good day and more courageous than any press secretary I've seen in a decade." He paused, sipping his drink. "I don't have to agree with her to respect her. In fact, I'd love to have her on this show. Because unlike 90% of the media class, she's got guts." The clip of that monologue would go viral by the end of the episode. Conservatives cheered Maher for finally seeing the light, while liberals accused him of platforming extremism. But Maher didn't care. He had long since abandoned the idea that staying silent was noble. Meanwhile, inside the West Wing, Karoline sat with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Trump was beaming. "Karoline, that was better than anything I saw on The Apprentice," he chuckled. "You took down Nancy without raising your voice. That's power." Karoline smiled but remained calm. "Mr. President, I just said what a lot of Americans are thinking. They're tired of elites mocking their values from cocktail dinners while ignoring the reality on the ground." Vance nodded in agreement. "This is the type of leadership young Americans need to see: clarity over chaos, truth over performance." Back on Capitol Hill, however, the response was less enthusiastic. Pelosi's team scrambled to do damage control, issuing a statement that Leavitt's remarks were disrespectful and rooted in right-wing disinformation. But the public wasn't interested in spin. Polls taken 2 days later showed a surprising trend. Karoline's favorability rating had surged, especially among independents and suburban women. Even some moderate Democrats admitted that while they didn't agree with her politics, they admired her courage. The American public, long weary of rehearsed soundbites and party-line jabs, had witnessed something rare, a genuine, unfiltered moment of truth in a room built for theatrics. Karoline Leavitt had become a national force overnight. With the viral momentum of Karoline Leavitt's speech still dominating news cycles, the Washington establishment quickly shifted from shock to retaliation. The media punditry, having missed the mark with their initial critiques, regrouped for coordinated attacks. The View opened with a fiery segment. Joy Behar called Karoline's remarks disrespectful to the spirit of bipartisanship and textbook Trumpism wrapped in pearls. Sunny Hostin accused her of gaslighting the nation and weaponizing youth and femininity to deflect from harmful policies. But the pushback didn't stop at commentary. Within 48 hours, a series of so-called fact checks emerged online, dissecting Karoline's speech word by word. Left-wing outlets branded her as dangerous, claiming she had intentionally misled the public about everything from vaccine mandates to border security. One headline from The Atlantic read, "Karoline Leavitt, the polished face of far-right nationalism." It was a full-blown smear campaign. CNN invited a roundtable of former Obama officials and liberal academics to psychoanalyze Karoline's rhetorical strategy. One professor claimed, "This is a sophisticated manipulation. She's not just speaking to the right, she's recruiting the middle." Karoline, for her part, remained silent. Her team at the White House didn't release any public response. There was no press conference, no Twitter clapback, nothing. She let the media spin itself into a frenzy, letting the contrast between their outrage and her composure do all the work. Until Thursday morning. Karoline appeared on Fox and Friends wearing a crisp cream blazer, calm and unbothered. The interview was slated to be a short commentary on Biden's rising inflation figures, but of course, the conversation turned. "Karoline, there's been a lot of backlash after your speech at the Correspondents Dinner," Steve Doocy said, leaning forward. "What's your response to critics who say you crossed a line?" Karoline didn't flinch. "There's only one line I'm interested in," she said, "and that's the one between truth and fiction. My speech wasn't an attack, it was a reminder. A reminder that the American people are tired of being laughed at by political royalty who failed them." She continued, "When Nancy Pelosi calls me unqualified, I take it as a compliment. Because if being qualified means serving in Washington for 40 years and still not solving a single major crisis, then thank God I don't qualify." The hosts were speechless for a moment, then erupted into applause. But it wasn't just the right taking notice anymore. That afternoon, Politico ran a feature titled, "Leavitt's Lightning Strike, A New Voice Emerges in GOP Power Circles." It detailed how insiders within the Trump campaign and even beyond were now pushing for Karoline to take on a more prominent national role, some whispering about her as a future press secretary and campaign surrogate. Meanwhile, in the DNC war room, a quiet panic began to grow. Their internal polling showed something concerning. Among young female voters, a demographic they had comfortably won in recent cycles, Karoline was gaining traction. Her blend of grace under fire and unapologetic clarity had made her something rare, a Republican Gen Z icon. Democratic strategists began meeting to plan a counteroffensive. One leaked memo from a prominent PAC read, "Karoline Leavitt is not just Trump's voice. She's his new weapon. Prepare accordingly." And then came the bombshell that shifted everything even further. Karoline was invited to appear on the Joe Rogan Experience. It wasn't just political anymore. She was becoming a cultural force. Her team debated the move. Appearing on the world's biggest podcast could amplify her message beyond the Beltway, but it also came with risks. Rogan didn't pull punches, and his guests were often expected to go beyond sound bites. Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'll go," she said. "Let's have the conversation the media won't." The day of the interview arrived. Millions across America tuned in. For some, it was curiosity. For others, admiration. And for the left-leaning elite, dread. The Joe Rogan Experience wasn't just a podcast. It was a juggernaut of influence that could shape national conversation with a single episode. Karoline Leavitt entered the Austin studio without a teleprompter, PR handler, or filter. Just her, a black blazer, and her usual calm but deadly demeanor. Joe Rogan started off with his trademark laid-back charm. "So, Karoline, you crashed a dinner, took on Nancy Pelosi, and now the media's losing their minds. What gives?" She smiled. "I didn't crash it, Joe. I walked into a room I was invited to, just not welcomed in." The two laughed, and from there, the conversation flowed into deeper waters. Karoline didn't dodge tough questions. She invited them. On the Biden economy. "We have an administration that prints money like it's candy and then pretends to be surprised when inflation hits working-class Americans hardest. President Trump's team knew how to stimulate growth without punishing small business. On immigration, this isn't about race or xenophobia. It's about law and order. You want to come to America? Great. Do it legally. Because right now, we're incentivizing chaos at our own borders while pretending it's compassionate. On the media, they don't report news anymore. They protect narratives. Pelosi tried to humiliate me because I challenged that narrative. And they hate when someone from outside their club doesn't stay quiet." Rogan, uncharacteristically serious, leaned in. "Do you ever worry you're putting yourself in real danger speaking out this boldly?" especially as a young woman? Karoline paused. I'm not naive. I get the threats. I get the warnings. But I'm more afraid of the alternative. A country where young women don't speak out because they're afraid. That's not America. Not the one I believe in. By the time the 3-hour episode ended, Rogan looked at his guest with open respect. You know, Karoline, I don't agree with everything you say, but you're sharp, articulate, and you've got a spine most politicians would kill for. The episode went viral instantly. It broke all previous records for Rogan's show within 24 hours. But the aftershocks were even more dramatic. The DNC held an emergency strategy meeting. Democratic consultants urged Biden's team to respond somehow, but there was no answer that wouldn't sound forced. The contrast was just too glaring. Karoline spoke with authenticity. Their side, with all its consultants and billion-dollar donors, sounded rehearsed and tired. Even mainstream outlets like Axios and The Hill admitted it. Karoline Leavitt had gone from Trump's press secretary to a political phenomenon. Back at the White House, President Trump watched the Rogan episode on his private TV and chuckled. That girl's got it, JD, he said to Vice President Vance. She's doing more for this movement than half of Congress combined. By the end of the week, a new poll from Rasmussen dropped. It stunned the pundit class. 74% of Republicans had a favorable view of Karoline Leavitt. 56% of independents said she was more relatable and honest than any current press figure. And shockingly, 29% of Democrats under 30 said they respected her courage and would consider hearing more from her. But Karoline didn't celebrate. Instead, she gave a press briefing the following morning, standing before the White House press corps like a seasoned general. No matter what's said about me by Pelosi, The View, or legacy media, I will never stop speaking plainly, fighting boldly, and standing for the millions of Americans who feel forgotten. Her final words echoed far beyond the White House walls. Mock me if you want. Dismiss me if you must. But remember this, when I speak, it's not just me you hear. It's the voice of the people you've tried to ignore. And for once, even the loudest critics had nothing to say.